The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, right as I was rolling up the last set of blueprints on my desk. My aunt's name lit up the screen, and I answered with a smile, expecting her usual check-in about Thanksgiving plans or whether I'd tried that new Italian place she kept recommending in Lincoln Park. Her voice was different, though. Quieter. The kind of quiet that meant she was measuring every word before she released it. "Claire, honey," she said, "I just want you to know I didn't find out until after. I would have called you sooner if I'd known." I set the blueprints down. "Find out about what?" There was a pause. The kind that stretches like taffy and tastes just as sweet until you realize it isn't sweet at all. "Your parents threw Ethan a dinner last Friday. A big one. At the Gentry. To celebrate his promotion." I blinked at the window. Outside, the Chicago skyline stood gray and indifferent in the October light. "Okay," I said slowly. "And? Claire." Her voice broke at the edge. "The whole family was there. Your dad's brothers, my sister, the cousins. Your grandparents flew in from Phoenix." The blueprints slipped from the edge of my desk and hit the floor. I didn't pick them up. "They didn't invite you," she said. "I asked your mother about it when I saw the photos on her Facebook this morning, and she said they thought it would be better if you weren't there. That you and Ethan have tension, and they didn't want it to affect his night." I sat very still. My grandparents had flown in from Phoenix. I hadn't seen them in over a year. My grandfather had a bad hip and didn't travel easily, and my parents had managed to get him on a plane to celebrate Ethan's corporate promotion, but not once, not for a single moment, had anyone thought to pick up a phone and tell me. "Aunt Carol," I said finally, "did my mom say anything else?" Another pause. "She said you've always had a way of making things about yourself." I thanked my aunt. I told her it was fine. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong, and I meant it. When I hung up, the office around me continued its ordinary rhythm, keyboards clicking, a printer humming somewhere down the hall, my colleague Marcus laughing at something through the glass partition. The world moved right along while mine sat very still. I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I opened Facebook. The photos were right there, pinned to my mother's profile like a trophy. The Gentry had soft amber lighting and white tablecloths, and everyone looked warm and fed and happy. My father stood with his arm around Ethan, both of them grinning so wide their cheeks looked like they might crack. My grandma was there in her blue cardigan, the one I'd given her 2 Christmases ago, seated beside my Uncle Paul, laughing at something off camera. My cousins I hadn't seen since July. My great-aunt Roberta, who drove in from Rockford for events she deemed worth the trip. There were 11 photos. I was in none of them. The caption under the first one read, "So proud of our son. This family has never shined brighter." I put my phone face down on the desk and pressed my palms flat against the surface. This family, like the word, had a clear and obvious boundary that everyone understood. Like the border around that table at the Gentry was drawn in permanent ink, and I'd been outside it so long they'd simply stopped noticing the gap. I thought about the last time I'd tried to be inside it. 6 months ago, at my parents' house in Naperville for Sunday dinner. I'd just been named lead architect on a riverfront development project, the kind of thing I'd worked toward for 7 years, the kind of milestone that didn't come easily in my field. I'd brought a bottle of wine to celebrate. My mother had smiled politely and asked if I'd seen Ethan's new car. My father had talked for 40 minutes about Ethan's new territory at work, the accounts he was managing, the trips the company was sending him on. I'd refilled my own glass twice and driven home before dessert. That was how it had always been. Ethan was the story. I was the audience. He was younger by 4 years, and from the time he could walk, my parents had treated his presence like an event. His baseball games got banners. His report cards got framed. When he graduated from a state school with a marketing degree, my father cried at the ceremony. When I graduated from Northwestern's architecture program with honors, my mother said, "At least now you'll always have something to fall back on." I had filed that comment away with all the others. There was a whole drawer in the back of my mind, full of things I'd never said back. Now I sat in my office after hours, the cleaning crew moving softly through the hallway, and I felt the drawer slide open all on its own. I drove to Naperville the next evening. I hadn't called ahead. I didn't think I needed to, and honestly, I was afraid if I called first, my nerve would fail me somewhere on the expressway, and I'd end up just sitting in a parking lot eating fast food and going home. My mother opened the door in her robe, surprised and not entirely pleased. "Claire, we weren't expecting you." "I know," I said. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside with the particular reluctance of someone who has already decided they won't enjoy what comes next. The living room was warm, the television murmuring, my father in his recliner with a bowl of chips and the remote. He looked up when I walked in, and his face settled into that careful blankness he'd always worn when I showed up somewhere inconvenient. "There was a dinner," I said, before either of them could redirect the conversation. "At the Gentry, Friday night. 11 photos on your Facebook page." My mother sat down on the couch and folded her hands. She had always been better at this than my father, the stillness, the composure, the way she could make you feel irrational for having feelings in the first place. "It was a small celebration for your brother," she said. "Grandma and Grandpa flew in from Phoenix. They wanted to see Ethan. They haven't seen me in over a year." My father set down his chips. "Claire, don't make this bigger than it is." "Dad." I looked at him steadily. "Everyone was there. Uncle Paul, Aunt Roberta, my cousins. You flew in Grandma and Grandpa. And I found out from Aunt Carol, who saw the photos on Facebook." My mother's expression shifted. Not softened, shifted. The way it did when she was preparing a different angle. "Sweetheart, you and Ethan have always had friction. We wanted his night to be peaceful." "What friction?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "We don't fight. We barely speak. I'm not in his life enough to cause friction." "That's exactly the problem," my father said, and I almost laughed. "So your solution was to not tell me the family was gathering and my grandparents were visiting?" "You've always had a way," of my mother started. "Of what?" I held her gaze. "Of existing? Of showing up? Of wanting to be included in the family I was born into?" The room went quiet. The television kept murmuring its irrelevant news, and outside a car rolled past with its headlights sweeping through the curtains. My father leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice taking on that tone he used to close conversations he'd already decided he'd won. "Your brother has worked very hard. That dinner was about celebrating him. We didn't think you'd want to sit through a night that was all about Ethan. You never seemed comfortable with that." I stared at him. "You never seemed comfortable with that." As if the years of shrinking at dinner tables, of watching his eyes move past my news to land on Ethan's, of sitting beside my grandmother at Christmas, while she recounted every detail of Ethan's life, and then asked me vaguely if I was still doing the building thing, as if all of it had been my discomfort, my failure to adjust. "I see," I said. My voice had gone very quiet, and I think that surprised them. They'd braced for something louder. "I spent 7 years building a career from the ground up," I said. "I've been lead architect on 3 major projects in the last 2 years. I bring something to every family event I attend, and I leave early because I've learned that nothing I say lands in this house the way it would anywhere else." I picked up my jacket from the armchair where I'd laid it. "You've spent 32 years teaching me that I'm not the child worth celebrating. I got the message a long time ago. I just kept hoping I was wrong." I started toward the door. "Claire." My mother's voice was sharp now, stripped of the composure. "Don't be dramatic. You're always doing this." I paused at the door, turned. "I'm getting married in the spring," I said. "His name is Daniel. We've been together for 3 years, and we've been engaged for 8 months. You've met him twice at family events, and you've never once asked his last name." My mother opened her mouth. My father's face had gone very still. "I've already started the guest list," I said. "Don't wait for an invitation." I closed the door behind me. The drive back to Chicago was long and dark, and I played no music. The expressway unfolded in front of my headlights, and I kept both hands on the wheel and breathed steadily. It wasn't relief I felt, not yet. It was more like the sensation after a long illness breaks, when your body is exhausted but something has finally been expelled. Daniel was awake when I got home, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop and a mug of tea, a stack of faculty papers spread beside him. He looked up the moment I came through the door, and in 2 seconds he had read my entire face. "Come here," he said quietly. I sat down beside him and told him everything. He listened the way he always did, completely, without interrupting, without preparing his response while I was still speaking. When I finished, he set his hand over mine. 8 months, he said. You've been wearing that ring for 8 months and they never asked. They never looked, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you know what I think? I shook my head. I think you've been trying to earn a seat at a table that was never going to be set for you. And I think part of you knew that, but you kept showing up anyway. Because you're the kind of person who believes people can change if you just give them enough chances. The tears came then, finally, silent and exhausted. He didn't try to fix it or reframe it, he just stayed. They don't get to be there, he said eventually. Not at the wedding, not at anything we build together. That's not punishment, that's just choosing who gets to be part of our lives. I nodded. I already knew. I think I'd known since I was standing at my parents' front door, and the word dramatic landed like the last stone in a wall I was finally done trying to scale. The next morning, I called my grandmother in Phoenix. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and a little surprised, the way it always was when she heard from me. "My sweet girl," she said. "I've been thinking about you." "Grandma," I said. "Were you at the dinner Friday night?" A pause. Longer than it should have been. "We were, honey. I thought you knew." I didn't know. I heard her exhale, low and slow. "Your mother told us it was a small family gathering." I assumed she stopped. Started again. "Claire, I want you to know. Your grandfather and I talked about you the whole flight home," I said to him. "Something doesn't add up. I should have called you sooner. I'm sorry." My throat was tight. "I know it wasn't your fault, Grandma." "No," she said, and her voice sharpened in a way it rarely did. "But it was someone's fault, and I intend to say so." She was 90 minutes off the plane from Phoenix, and she was already gearing up for battle on my behalf. I loved her so much in that moment it was almost hard to breathe. "I have something to tell you," I said. "I'm getting married." The sound she made somewhere between a gasp and a sob and a laugh filled the whole kitchen and made the tears come back. She asked about Daniel. She asked for every detail. She asked if she could come to Chicago before the wedding just to see me, to sit at my kitchen table and hear about my life. The real version. The one that didn't get summarized in 30 seconds at family dinners. "I'll be there," she said. "Front row. And you can count on me, Claire. I'll clap louder than anyone." The weeks that followed were strange in their quietness. I had expected something from my parents, a call, a message, even a forwarded email with a guilt trip artfully embedded. What I got instead was a Facebook post. My mother had written it in the church community group she'd been a member of for 20 years. I found out about it from an old college friend who sent me a screenshot with a question mark and nothing else. The post was carefully composed. My mother was talented at making injury look like grace. She wrote about the difficulty of raising a child who struggled with family closeness, who had chosen to withdraw rather than invest in the relationships that mattered. She wrote about her son's wonderful celebration and how, in the spirit of peace, certain people had not been included, and how painful it had been to make that decision as a parent. She asked for prayers for family healing. The comments filled up like a slow tide. Churchwomen who had known my mother for decades, family friends who had watched me grow up, people who only knew the version of me that existed in my mother's narration, the difficult one, the one who made things complicated. I read every comment once. Then I put my phone down on the kitchen counter and walked to the window and stood there for a long time, watching the traffic on the street below. What she had done was precise. She had published her version of the story first, in a space where her credibility was established and mine was not. Anything I said now would look reactive. Any detail I offered would be filtered through the frame she had already built. I understood then what I had been dealing with my whole life. It wasn't just favoritism. It wasn't carelessness. It was something more deliberate, the careful, consistent construction of a narrative in which I was always the problem, always the difficult one, always the reason things couldn't be nice. She had been building that story for 32 years, and she had just published the final chapter to an audience of 300. I was still standing at the window when Daniel came home. He read the post in silence, his jaw set. He called his father that evening. I had met Richard Ashworth twice, both times briefly, and I had found him to be the kind of man who made every room feel steadier simply by entering it. He was a retired federal judge. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The next morning, my mother's post was gone. She never explained its removal. There was no apology, no follow-up. The post simply vanished, and the silence that replaced it was somehow louder than anything she'd written. I didn't know exactly what Richard had said to her, and I didn't ask. What mattered was that for the first time in my life, someone with standing had looked at what was being done to me and said, clearly and firmly, no. I was sitting at my drafting table when Daniel called me that afternoon. My dad asked if we'd come to the house in Vermont for the wedding, he said. He and my mom want to host it on the property, if you'd like that. It holds about 50 guests comfortably. They said it's yours if you want it. I set my pencil down. I had driven past the Vermont house once, on a fall trip, the leaves burning orange and gold along the hills. It was an old colonial with white fences and a meadow in the back that looked like something out of a painting. I had thought, casually and without direction, that it seemed like the kind of place where something important should happen. I'd love that, I said. We started the guest list that weekend, sitting at the dining room table with coffee and a notepad. Every name was a choice, and every choice felt clean. My grandmother went down first. My Aunt Carol. 3 cousins on my father's side who had always treated me like a person and not a footnote. My best friend from graduate school, Phoebe, who had been at every important moment of my adult life and had never once let me sit alone in a hard one. I got to the bottom of the first page and looked at the list. It was smaller than a wedding list usually was. It was also the most honest document I had ever made. My parents' names were not on it. Ethan's name was not on it. I had thought that decision would be harder. I had prepared for a night of lying awake, cycling through what-ifs and guilt and the strange grief of choosing peace over obligation. But when I looked at the list and saw only names that belonged there, the feeling wasn't grief. It was clarity. The months before the wedding passed with a warmth I hadn't known was possible. My grandmother flew into O'Hare on a rainy Thursday in February, and I picked her up at baggage claim and held her for a long time in the middle of the terminal, not caring about the foot traffic moving around us. She met Daniel over dinner that night and approved of him in the frank and immediate way she did everything. "He looks at you like you're the most interesting thing in the room," she told me in the kitchen while we were doing dishes. "That's the only thing that matters." My Aunt Carol helped me choose the flowers. Phoebe talked me through the invitations with the precision of someone who had been waiting for years to properly celebrate me and intended to do it right. My cousin Jess, who was studying fashion design in Boston, altered my dress herself after 3 fittings and cried at each one. I had never been the center of anything my whole life, not in a way that felt like love rather than performance. Learning to let people fuss over me without bracing for the catch was its own quiet work. The morning of the wedding was cool and bright, the Vermont sky the kind of deep blue that only happens in October. The meadow behind the house had been strung with lights the night before, and the white chairs arranged in rows faced a simple arch wound with greenery and cream roses. Everything was small by wedding standards. Everything was exactly right. When I stepped out of the house in my dress, my grandmother was waiting on the porch. She had her handkerchief already in hand, and when she saw me, she pressed it against her eyes and reached out with her other hand for mine. "Your mother missed this," she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, sad fact. "I know," I said. "Her loss," she said. Then she lifted her chin and squared her shoulders, and in that gesture I saw 30 years of a woman who had watched something wrong happen to her granddaughter and not had the information she needed to stop it. She had the information now. "Let's go get you married." Daniel was waiting at the arch. He always looked steadiest when I needed him to, and today was no exception. When I reached him, the whole small crowd went still in that way that happens when something true is about to be witnessed. My grandmother in the front row, dabbing her eyes before the ceremony had even started. Aunt Carol beside her, holding Jess's hand. Phoebe standing at my side in a soft burgundy dress, her posture absolutely perfect. The vows were words I had written myself. Not borrowed from a template, not assembled from what I thought sounded right. I had sat at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. and written down exactly what I wanted to say, and saying them out loud in that meadow, in front of the people who had earned the right to hear them, was the most truthful thing I had ever done. When the ceremony ended and the applause started, my grandmother stood first. The dinner was long and full of laughter. Richard Ashworth gave a toast that made the whole table tear up without once being sentimental. Jess told an embarrassing story from graduate school that I had specifically asked her not to tell, and told it anyway, and I laughed so hard I spilled my wine. Daniel's mother taught my grandmother a card game during dessert, and the two of them were still playing when most of the other guests had moved out to the meadow. At some point in the evening, one of Daniel's colleagues asked me gently about my family's absence. Had there been difficulty with travel? Was everyone well? I smiled and said, I only invited the people who show up for me. The colleague nodded and didn't press further, and the conversation flowed on. I danced with my grandmother at the end of the night, the two of us moving slowly to something quiet and old that she'd requested from the band. She held my hand firmly and kept saying, I'm so proud of you, in a low voice, like a prayer being repeated until it took hold. I should have done more, she said. When you were younger, I should have seen it better. You see it now, I said. She squeezed my hand. I do. The drive home from Vermont was long, and Daniel and I talked through most of it, the way we did on long drives loosely, without agenda, picking up threads and putting them down. Somewhere in Massachusetts, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. I glanced at it at a rest stop. It was Ethan. He'd heard about the wedding from a cousin one of mine, presumably, though I hadn't asked them to keep it private. The message was short. It said he hoped I was doing okay and that things between us didn't have to be like this. It said Mom and Dad were really hurt. It said maybe we could all sit down sometime. I read it twice. Then I locked my phone and put it in my bag. Not tonight. Not on this particular night that belonged to me and the people who had chosen to be there for it. 3 months later, Ethan called. Not a text, this time a call, mid-morning, while I was between meetings. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then something made me answer. He didn't sound like himself. The smoothness was gone, the easy confidence that had always been his factory setting. He sounded tired, and a little younger than he actually was. He'd been let go. The company had restructured, and his territory had been eliminated. He was working through his savings and had a few months before things got genuinely difficult. He wasn't asking for money, not exactly. He was asking if I knew anyone, if I could put in a word somewhere, if maybe I had contacts in any of the firms that were hiring. The old version of me would have said yes immediately, would have been grateful for the reason to be needed, would have attached my help to the hope that it might finally make me worth something in his eyes. I was quiet for a moment. Outside my office window, the Chicago River was iron gray and steady. Ethan, I said. I'm glad you called. He exhaled. Yeah? I want you to know I don't have any hard feelings toward you personally. I never did. I paused. But when I needed family this year, you weren't there. You were at that dinner. You knew I wasn't invited, and you never reached out. And when Mom posted about me on Facebook, I didn't hear from you. Silence on his end. I've spent a long time trying to earn a place in this family, I said. I'm done trying. I've built something good without it, and I intend to protect that. Claire, I hope you land on your feet. I really mean that. I kept my voice even. Not cruel, not cold. Just honest. But I'm not the right person to call for this. I ended the call. I sat very still for a moment. Then I got up, got a glass of water from the kitchen down the hall, and came back and sat down and started on my next set of drawings. The work was there. The apartment was warm. Daniel was picking up dinner on his way home, and my grandmother was coming to visit the following weekend, and in 7 months we were expecting a baby that Phoebe had already started knitting a blanket for in secret, though she thought I didn't know. A package arrived from my mother 2 weeks later. A large one, wrapped in white and tied with ribbon, with a card that said nothing about the wedding and nothing about Ethan, and said only that she was thinking of me and wanted to send something for the baby. I opened the outer packaging. Inside was a gift box. Inside the gift box was a soft, expensive baby blanket in the palest yellow, folded neatly, with a small card attached in my mother's handwriting. To our grandchild, with love. I held it for a long moment. Then I refolded it carefully, placed it back in the box, wrote a short note, "Thank you for thinking of us. We're doing well," and shipped it back. No explanation, no argument, No door left open for a conversation I didn't have the energy to have. Just the blanket, returned, with the same cleanness I had been trying to find for 32 years. Daniel asked me about it that evening, and I told him what I'd done. He nodded slowly. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about it. The apartment was quiet around us, the kind of full quiet that came from choosing carefully who got to be inside it. "Free," I said. My grandmother called that Sunday morning, as she did most Sundays now. She had started the habit after the wedding, and I had started looking forward to it the way I used to look forward to things before I'd learned to keep my expectations small. She told me about her neighbor's new garden and a book she was reading, and a letter she'd gotten from an old friend in New Mexico. Then she asked about the baby, and her voice turned warm and careful, the way it did when she was holding something gently. "I've been thinking," she said. "About names." I laughed. "Me too. Your grandfather and I have a few opinions, if you're interested." "When have your opinions ever been optional?" Her laugh was the same as it had always been, bright and a little unruly, not polished, completely real. The laugh of someone who had not been told to quiet down. I had grown up listening for that laugh across crowded rooms, trying to find my way to it through the noise of a family that had never quite made space for me. Now I had made the space myself. The baby moved that afternoon for the first time, just a flutter, just the faintest suggestion of a presence, and I pressed my hand flat against my side and stood in the kitchen where the afternoon light came in, and I thought about everything that had been said to me over the years, every dismissal and diminishment and closed door. And then I thought about everything that had grown in spite of it. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because it had been given to me, because I had built it, one hard choice at a time, out of the rubble of what had been taken away. I stayed there in the light for a little while longer, my hand against my side, feeling the quiet astonishment of a life that had turned out to be mine after all.